Welcome to the N1 Fitness Podcast. Today I'm stoked to have Gabrielle Fundaro back on the show. Originally, she was on episode 34 and 35 because I basically held her hostage with questions and we had to break up our chat into a couple parts. Shockingly, she agreed to come back on again. Welcome, Gabrielle. You're a brave soul.
Thank you.
So good to have you. When we're going to be talking about the immune system. So when it comes to the immune system, can you just give us a bit of a general rundown or overview of what the immune system actually is and what its primary roles are?
Absolutely. So the immune system helps us to fend off pathogens, so foreign substances that could cause us to become ill. And the immune system has two main branches. They do interact with each other, but we have an innate immune system that we're born with. And the innate immune system mounts an immune response to pathogens, even if it hasn't met them before. So that's sort of an inborn immune response. Whereas the adaptive immune system doesn't mount an immune response on its first exposure to a substance. It actually has to learn that that substance is good or bad, something that we should either tolerate or have a reaction to. And the adaptive immune system is really to blame for allergies. But it's also helpful because the adaptive immune system also allows us to tolerate our own tissues or the tissues of a donor, or it might cause us to reject the tissues of a donor. Our immune system also is really important for us as women tolerating our fetal tissue. So when we're growing a baby, it's a foreign object. You can think of it like that, but our immune system has to learn not to reject that even though there are foreign proteins there, that we need to tolerate those proteins and not mount an immune response, because that would cause rejection of the unborn child. So the immune response, it's sort of like it's little soldiers basically that cover the external parts of our body and the internal parts of our body as well. And even though we think of the gut being internal, it's actually in contact with the external environment. So you could think of yourself sort of like what I used to tell my students, we're a meat donut. So we have a bunch of stuff on the inside, but like the hole in the middle is still kind of outside of our body.
Right. That's a great breakdown. Now, as far as those two aspects of the immune system and how they relate to us on sort of a daily basis, are there like telltale signs of being immune compromised in some way that folks can keep an eye out for? So maybe, I don't know, something like slow wound healing, or they're getting sick all the time. Like what are some of the things that folks can look out for?
Absolutely. So you could be immunocompromised, and some medical conditions will cause you to be immunocompromised. There are certainly some prescription drugs that are immunosuppressive on purpose, because if we have an overactive immune system, we need to downregulate that. But then that does make you more susceptible to infections. And in some cases, if you're having symptoms like that, like poor wound healing, and you're getting sick a lot, it could also be a sign of a nutrient deficiency. So you may have a vitamin and mineral deficiency, or it could be also a sign that you're overtrained. So when we have chronic cortisol release, that can be immunosuppressive. And so that's why, when you're an athlete and you're training really hard, not only could you be, not necessarily seeing benefit in the gym from that, but also you could be increasing your risk of illness. So there are a lot of signs that, you have not necessarily that you're clinically immunocompromised, but just that you have a suppression of the immune system. And so you're not able to fend off pathogens as well. When it comes to the gut, if you are, if you have a dysbiosis there, or just a lack of not just diversity in terms of different microbes, but sufficient populations of microbes. You can also have a harder time fighting off pathogens. We often see that in individuals who are, in the hospital for a long period of time, they're more readily infected with hospital-acquired illnesses like C. diff, and we're in contact with these microbes all the time. I mean, when we go to the grocery store and we touch produce that other people have touched, and when we are in the gym and things like that, we're constantly in contact with pathogenic microbes. But normally we can fight them off because we have enough of the beneficial microbes. But if not, then we can actually see an overgrowth of those pathogenic microbes, and then that's where we see dysbiosis, and that can lead to gastrointestinal issues.
Right, that's fascinating stuff. Now, before we get into the various tests that we can do for food allergies, sensitivity, stuff like that, can you just share with us the difference between something that the immune system recognizes versus something like a sensitivity and then a full-blown allergy? So how should we think about that sliding scale in regards to the immune system?
Absolutely. So sensitivity, that is digestive. So you could think of a sensitivity or an intolerance. Lactose intolerance, for example, that's one that most people are familiar with. That means that we can't digest the sugar lactose, which is found in milk. That's due to a deficiency of an enzyme called lactase. So the way we produce enzymes is basically we have genetic material that's sort of like a recipe book. And we have cellular machinery that reads that recipe and then makes a protein based on that recipe. That protein could be a peptide hormone, or it could be an enzyme. And in this case, we're talking about the lactase enzyme. So if you don't have either the gene for that, or for whatever reason, perhaps the genetic machinery isn't working properly and you're not making that protein or that enzyme, you can't break down that sugar. But the bacteria in your gut can break down that sugar. And when they do that, they can produce gas as a side effect. And so that's why people will experience things like gas and bloating and cramping. It's really just they're producing too much gas and it's causing cramping, and it can also cause diarrhea, constipation. So that is a sensitivity or an intolerance. It's digestive. It has to do with our digestive enzymes. An allergy is immune. So that is our immune system identifying a protein as an intruder and then mounting a response against that. And it's really a case of just mistaken identity. It's not that that protein is actually pathogenic or will actually cause a disease. It's just that our immune system got a little bit confused and decided that that was a thing that needed to be attacked. And so this is what happens with an autoimmune disease, is that your own immune system has mistakenly identified your cells as intruders and then kills them. So in the case of type 1 diabetes, that's what happens with our pancreatic beta cells, is our immune system identifies those as intruders and destroys them, and so our pancreas can no longer produce insulin. That's just one example of an autoimmune disease, but there are many others. So when we talk about looking in the gut, if we're looking at a food sensitivity, is our digestive system acting in the way it should. Whereas if we're looking at an inflammatory bowel disease like ulcerative colitis, that is our immune system is not acting in the way that it should. And that's causing damage to our tissues. So that's the big difference, is that we're looking at digestive system versus immune system. And it just so happens that when we're looking at the gut, our immune system malfunctioning then does cause digestive malfunctions, because we're causing damage to the cells that need to absorb our nutrients. And so they can't perform their function properly. And so we see symptoms actually in the gut, things like diarrhea and bloating, cramps, pain, ulcers, obviously in the case of ulcerative colitis. So that's the big separation that people need to understand, is that, immune system, and then specifically with immune system, we're looking at kind of the role of antibodies, which gets into the food sensitivity testing, which is sort of a misnomer.
Right. Which we'll definitely get to. Now, Something that I've noticed with myself, just in a practical everyday sense, is I can tolerate dairy products from a digestive standpoint, but my skin really flares up when I eat those foods. And so is that something that you've noticed in some of your clients that you've worked with?
I actually, I have an awesome resource in that one of my clients is actually a dermatologist. And I pick their brain frequently because I do hear that from some people that they say, especially with casein shakes, that they do experience an increase in acne when they have these products. And there is certainly a link between the gut microbiome and skin conditions. And there's also even a skin biome, and that can also influence the prevalence of acne. So I think that that's an area that hasn't been explored as much, but it does seem like in terms of, the scientific support, and then also anecdotally, even though anecdote isn't the strongest piece of evidence, but because so many people experience that, I do think that there's some justification in, linking diet to skin health. So there's a condition called psoriasis. With psoriasis, you get skin plaques. And there is a link between psoriasis and gut dysbiosis. I mean, there's really a link between gut dysbiosis and most conditions
pretty
that
much
are associated
everything.
with inflammation. Yeah, exactly. And so yeah, absolutely. I would say that, if you have skin conditions, and you notice that you can pare that down really specifically with food inclusion or exclusion, then, at worst, there's not really a link there, but like you're clearing up your skin through some other means of removing that food.
Yeah, and it's something that I've noticed in some of my other clients too around eczema and how food intolerance can flare that up in a big way. It's similar to psoriasis, like you mentioned too. So it's like if it works for you by eliminating those foods, like fuck, why not?
Yeah, exactly. This is another anecdote, but, weeks ago I was in New York and kind of doing a little bit of a food tour and just eating foods that I don't usually eat. And it was a lot of, restaurant food and things like that are not part of my habitual diet. And I was diagnosed with IBS, which it's not inflammatory, but just irritable bowel syndrome. It's basically just like you have probably a bunch of things that you don't digest very well, and you get your stomach upset, and you can have either IBS-D, IBS-C, or a combination of both. And, so just the gastrointestinal symptoms aside, I really noticed that not only did my skin appearance worsen in terms of acne, but also my eczema came back. And I hadn't had an eczema breakout in a really, really long time. And I get it in sort of the normal places like inside of the elbows, back of the neck. And I was just like, wow, that's so weird. And there could have been a bunch of other factors. But that was just one that I noticed that was, really within just a couple of days. And then when I got back home and got back to my normal routine, everything subsided. So, yeah, I mean,
tough to argue with that.
I know. Yeah. I was like, but it's because and as I'm learning more about this, and it's opening my mind more, because having an immune response then makes you more prone to have an immune response, if that makes sense. So if you have something that causes hypersensitivity of your immune system, then you become more sensitive to reacting to other substances. So it could be sort of, a little bit like it's like a firestorm of, you've gotten one thing that has sensitized you now, and now you're much more likely to have a sensitivity to other things. And this is once again, something I got from the dermatologist that I speak to when we were talking about different ways to, combat acne. And I had found this company that kind of makes product for you based on what you have used in the past and what you liked. And his opinion was that it's not necessarily great to compound things, because if you do have a sensitivity to a part of that product, you're more likely to have an exacerbated reaction to the whole thing. So it could be that, whatever we're having in our diet that's causing a sensitivity is now making us more likely to have an immune response maybe when we shouldn't.
Yeah, and that totally makes sense as far as thinking about the immune system as like an overall load. And so, for example, like when you were on the road traveling, eating these funky foods, that's a stressor in itself, but also likely your sleep wasn't quite as buttoned up as it is at home. And there are just other factors at play that contribute, that make it more likely for you to respond negatively to those funky foods that you're not used to.
Exactly.
Now, getting onto the food sensitivity, allergy testing, all that good stuff, we got like IgA, IgG, IgM, all these different acronyms.
Yes.
What does the research say about what these tests are looking at, and then how are they looking as far as accuracy goes?
Well, I will say right up front that the IgG test is completely invalidated. The Association of, I'm trying to remember this acronym, but it's like the Association of Immunology, Allergenists, and something else that I can't remember. But I've posted about this on my Instagram too, and there have been multiple stories about this, that companies are using this IgG food sensitivity test, even though it's never been validated. And really, if you look at the way antibodies work and their functions, it is not actually indicating an allergy at all. So an IgG food sensitivity test is not testing for allergies, and it's really not even testing for food sensitivities. Like I said, a food sensitivity or an intolerance is something digestive. So these companies are really conflating the role of the immune system and the digestive system, and trying to implicate that the IgG antibody is indicative of a food that you can't digest. And most people find when they get their results back that they have quote unquote reactions or sensitivities to foods that they're habitually eating. And it may be a lot of food. So I even had a person reach out to me on Instagram, and they were asking about this, and they said that after that, they stuck to the same 7 foods that they could tolerate for something like 4 months. If that doesn't, raise alarm bells, we don't have to have like the most varied diet all the time. It doesn't have to be, sometimes simplicity is great because it helps us with compliance. But sticking to just 7 foods over the course of months could really readily lead to disordered eating, orthorexia, food avoidance. Obviously, we know that a low dietary diversity of plants especially is associated with low microbial diversity in the gut. And it causes this person so much stress because now they're examining every single food that they're taking in, trying to see if it contains any of these foods that they had quote unquote sensitivities to, even though they thought, well, gosh, I eat these foods all the time and I've never had issues with them. That's because the IgG antibody is not there to induce an immune response. It is there as sort of a memory antibody saying, we've come into contact with this foreign person before. Like, this isn't someone, we've met this guy before. Okay, I remember him. IgG, that antibody, is actually the one that can cross the placental barrier and allow a female's body to tolerate the fetus. So we know the IgG antibody, its presence is not indicative of a food sensitivity or of an allergy. It is just indicative of having been exposed to that, what we call antigen before. So an antigen is just a substance that has been labeled as, we need to figure out what this is. So it is about memory. And there are actually 4 different types of IgG antibodies. And what they really do, their main role is really what we call opsonization. So they just surround an antigen and just like hold it there for a second. And, so we can have our immune cells show up and identify it. So having the presence of an IgG antibody does not mean that we have an immune response to that food. Now, IgA and IgM antibodies are, and IgG is also the most abundant antibody. So, you're going to have a lot of it. It just means you've been exposed to something. IgA and IgM, we have those in very low amounts. And again, they don't really play a huge role in allergies. IgA is a little more common in the gut, and it can cause an immune response, but by way of activating mast cells that produce histamine. But what we really need to identify, if we want to find out that we have an allergy to something, is the IgE antibody. So that testing for that does indicate an allergic response, because the IgE antibody activates the specific immune cells that produce the chemicals that give us an allergic response. So histamine is one of the big ones. So we call these cells granulocytes because when they are activated, they release granules. So the big ones here are basophils and mast cells. And so when they are bound by the IgE antibody, they produce histamine, and that's what gives us an immune response. So an allergy can actually be life-threatening. I mean, it can be something as mild as itchiness and runny nose and poofy eyes, hives, but then it can also cause anaphylaxis. And so that's where we have actual airway closure. An allergy can actually be fatal. A food sensitivity will never be fatal. It will just cause you discomfort. So that's another big thing to be aware of, that is that the possible severity of a sensitivity versus an allergy. So if you want to be tested for a food allergy, for a suspected food allergy, you would want to go to an allergenist for that. And they can look for the IgE antibody, or they can do a skin prick test, and they actually, induce an allergic response. And you can see that. So you'll have, if you are actually allergic to something, that area where they do the skin prick will be red and inflamed. You're having just a topical allergic response to that. So those things that are, these tests that are validated, that are given by an allergenist, that type of practitioner, those are what you would want to invest your time and money in, and not the food sensitivity tests. Because what you'll find is that you will get results back that show that you're sensitive to foods that you habitually eat, because your immune system has identified those as, oh, these are things that we normally eat, we tolerate them, and there's not going to be an immune response to this.
That's an awesome breakdown. Now, if folks, some folks, if they wanted to, could go the actual formal testing route, or some folks could do something like an elimination diet and do themselves. Like, how do you recommend folks start with this stuff and find out what they're potentially sensitive to if they're having some negative reactions to foods?
Yeah. Well, certainly an allergy is it's almost always going to be more readily identifiable, in that, an allergic response looks and feels different from a digestive response. So if if you're eating something and you experience, the things like what you would get, people think of allergies, they think of like outdoor allergies. You can have swelling of the mucous membranes with an allergy. You could certainly have, wheezing and itchiness. You may have gastrointestinal symptoms as well, but an allergy usually is going to be identified. And in most cases, it's going to be identified pretty early on. The fortunate thing is that you can actually outgrow allergies. So now even the recommendations for children's exposure to potential allergens is changing, because people are finding that even if a child has an allergic response to something like peanuts, it's one of the most common allergies, that they may grow out of it. And also that early exposure to these potential allergens actually seems to lead to tolerance. So that's one of the nice things, is that you can actually, it's not, super common, but you could grow out of an allergy. You don't necessarily grow out of a food sensitivity or an intolerance. If you have an enzyme deficiency, that means that you don't have the ability, or you don't have the recipe for that protein, and your genes are not going to change. They're going to stay with you for the duration of your life. The only thing that changes is the expression of those genes. But if you just don't have that gene anymore, there's no way for you to make that protein. So if you do have a deficiency, or the other option is that perhaps you have a biome, perhaps the microbiota of your gut that profile specifically produces a lot of gas in response to certain fibers. That's something that, it's not genetic, not immune, not digestive. That's just the bacteria that you have. And whether, and to the magnitude we can change those is sort of questionable. But if that's your issue, then you could certainly reduce your symptoms by changing the types of fibers that you're eating. So in people who have IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, it looks like controlling the types of fibers that we eat. That seems to be one of the best ways for reducing gastrointestinal issues. And that's through the low FODMAP diet, which is just a form of an elimination diet. And the only risk with that is that it can be low in fiber if we're not cognizant about making sure that we're getting sufficient fiber, because the low FODMAP diet is all about limiting a lot of sources of fiber that are readily fermentable, because it's the process of fermentation that causes the gas, that causes the discomfort. So this is really, and I since our last podcast even, I've recommended this to multiple clients that have come to me that have, they're curious about it. They just want to try. And I say, okay, it's a time commitment, because you have, the first couple weeks where you're doing that, low FODMAP only. And then after that, you don't want to stay with that forever. We don't want to have a restrictive diet forever. But after that, we're adding in just one food at a time, and then examining symptoms for a few days, and then, move on to the next food. So, it's completely up to them how fast they want to reintroduce things. I just make recommendations as, not yet an RD, but like this seems to be something that really helps and is evidence-based. And from what I found is that people are able to really specifically identify what foods cause them gastrointestinal distress. And it can be something as innocuous as an apple. I mean, I had a client who I thought, oh yeah, apples. And within a day, they had really severe bloating and cramping. Nothing else had changed, just the inclusion of that apple. And then removing the apples from the diet went back to normal. So it is a time-consuming process, but I think because it's inexpensive, it's free. You can look up lists of low FODMAP foods and things to avoid. It's free. It's just a time commitment. And from there, you're N of one, your own experiment, but you can identify what foods seem to really cause you GI distress. And you're not, trying to throw a bunch of supplements and whatnot. You're not spending money on tests that are not validated. And when you're looking for a food sensitivity versus an allergy, food sensitivity, like I said, it's not going to be life-threatening. You certainly wouldn't want to do this if you had a suspected food allergy you thought might induce anaphylaxis, and I just want to see if I can handle peanuts today. Don't do that. That's a bad idea. This is only for things that are, not life-threatening.
Fatal, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, totally. As far as the IgE being the most accurate, as far as evidence-based goes, are there any drawbacks that you see to the IgE right now, or how does the accuracy look of that right now, at least?
It seems like that is the validated test because the IgE specifically is there to activate mast cells and activate basophils and cause what happens as part of the adaptive immune response is that your body is producing new immune cells, and it produces immune cells that sort of have an antibody bank. So they have a memory of all of the things that they're supposed to react to. And so that's what we're specifically looking for, is the antibodies that are used in that immune response based on memory. Because remember, like I mentioned in the beginning, our first exposure of an allergen doesn't cause the reaction, because our adaptive immune system has to be educated to that being an issue. So we have these cells that are called antigen-presenting cells. They grab a potential pathogen, and they bring it to another immune cell and say, hey, look at this. Is this something that's supposed to be here? And then that immune cell will say, yeah, that's okay. Or, oh, no, that's not supposed to be here. And then that immune cell will activate other immune cells and say, hey, we've got a pathogen here. We need to make a bunch of antibodies. We have to activate all the other immune cells. Like, all forces go, because the innate immune system can only handle so much. like I said, that's the one that's, our first line of defense. It can mount an immune response. But if we need to have a really, really big, powerful attack, a powerful defense, we have to have both innate and adaptive immune systems. And they actually work together. So they're not two totally independent things. We have members of the innate immune system. Some of those are those antigen presenting cells that will then interact, communicate with the adaptive immune system. If they're like, hey, we can't keep up with this, we need more help, then the adaptive immune system will kick in. And that's why an allergic response can be so life-threatening, because it's really, really strong. Or when we have a really severe cold and we are just knocked out, because that is, we're really trying to fight off a pathogen. Like our bodies say, it gets to the point where we're like, oh, well, heat kills pathogens, so we're just going to give you like a temperature of 102 and kill all this stuff off. And your brain's like, hey, wait a minute, like this also kills the person. But
the host, yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, our immune systems, they can really kind of go haywire.
Yeah, I think a cool way for folks to think about it, and you touched on this, is just like sort of allocating resources from like an army or a war sort of soldier standpoint, sending out resources into areas that that need them, and then scaling back if need be, and double checking to see, is this a threat? How much of a threat? Do we need to send more here or somewhere else? Just sort of thinking about it as the colonel or the general sending out and calling orders out to the foot soldiers on the ground.
Exactly.
Okay, cool. Now, moving on to the micronutrient tests. So folks looking at things like vitamins, minerals, etc., what are the various tests out there? And then if someone was interested in getting something like this done, what route would you recommend that they take with that?
There are so many different tests for micronutrient status that I don't even know all of them. But I can tell you that things like testing your hair, doesn't seem to be well supported in evidence. Also, just the presence of a micronutrient deficiency in one of these tests doesn't necessarily mean that you have a clinical deficiency that would cause symptoms. So in some cases, you could have just a subclinical deficiency, and you might not, and it's just a temporary thing, like maybe you've had a lapse in your habitual diet and doesn't actually cause any issues, and then if you were to retest a few months down the line, it would be normal. Just like when we go in for tests, for your physical, and they do a metabolic panel, like you might have a test where your liver enzymes look a little bit elevated because lately you've been working out hard, or maybe you drank last week or something. And so it's just a snapshot of what's happening in that moment. It doesn't necessarily mean that you have liver failure. And if you're an athlete and you've gone in for a metabolic panel, you probably will have elevated BUN and elevated creatinine and maybe elevated liver enzymes, because those are all associated with a high protein diet and muscle damage. And so when I get my metabolic testing or my blood panel done, I just tell the doctor, hey, my creatinine and BUN levels are going to be elevated. I take creatine, I work out really hard, and I'm not in kidney failure or anything like that. And so usually they kind of laugh and then ask, like, why, how do you know that? So just to keep that in mind, that it is just a snapshot. But that being said, if your diet is, and the good thing to do too, just to get an idea, I use Chronometer, it's just a free diet analysis app. But if you even just did like a 3-day analysis of, 2 weekdays and 1 weekend day, then that gives you an idea of your habitual diet. And if you see that you are habitually low in things like calcium and vitamin D, then it might be worth supplementing with those specific micronutrients, especially because we know that most people are getting insufficient calcium and vitamin D, and they're really big right now. Vitamin D has been highlighted not just for bone health, but also for muscle health. So when we use that information about our habitual diet, also what we know about the standard American diet and where most people are lacking, we know that vitamin D and calcium deficiency are super common. And taking an appropriate amount of those, so about 1,000 to 1,300 mg per day of calcium, and usually that comes with the vitamin D if you can get them together. then that's going to be a prudent way to reduce your chance of a deficiency. Because, maybe if you're lactose intolerant, you don't get a lot of dairy. So that's totally fine. Or if you're vegan, you will have to supplement with B12. Or if you are a woman who is expecting to become pregnant, supplementing with folate. So there are some times when supplementation is warranted, based on your life stage and your habitual diet. So then is it even really worth, testing for a micronutrient deficiency? Because you can look at your diet for free and say, oh, I'm not, eating this, that, and the other thing, and either increase, the food sources of those products, which is pretty much always superior to taking a supplement. But then if that's not an option, then going ahead and supplementing. But realizing also that vitamins and minerals, especially those that we use in metabolic processes, like our B vitamins, work as coenzymes or cofactors. So they're not destroyed in the process. We use them and then let them go. Not necessarily as much, with calcium, we're actually taking that calcium, we're taking phosphorus and putting it into bone. So we don't reuse that as much, even though there is calcium turnover in the body. We don't want to be taking away calcium from the bone to use it in other processes. But there are some nutrients, some micronutrients that we don't necessarily need to even supplement every single day because we're not destroying them, we're just recycling them. Whereas with our macronutrients, we do destroy those. We're actually getting energy from those, but it's not the case with micronutrients. So I would say, if someone does want to go down the testing route, first, just analyze your diet and see if there's even a reason to do that, because it's going to be an added expense. If you get it for free, sure, just go ahead and take a look. I mean, when you do a blood panel, usually they're going to be testing like your iron levels and hemoglobin and sometimes like ferritin and things like that to look at your how well you can store iron, your iron stores versus your iron carrying capacity and things like that. But, there are some things that really, if you're eating an omnivorous diet, it's very unlikely that you'll have a clinical deficiency in any of the B vitamins, for example.
Amazing. Love that breakdown. Now, there are a ton of different autoimmune conditions, and the stats as far as how much they're increasing in prevalence is fucking nuts. So can you tell us a little bit about what an autoimmune condition is? You touched on this a little bit earlier, but then how these conditions relate to the gut and gut health?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, autoimmune just means that your immune system has identified your cells as intruders and then has mounted an immune defense against them, and that causes tissue damage. And you're right that we have had an uptick in the diagnosis of autoimmune disorders, and we've been able to correlate that with dysbiosis. Now, whether we have an actual increase in the number of autoimmune disorders or we have an increase in the number of diagnoses, that's a question. Same thing if we're talking about anything related to mental health, autism spectrum disorders and things like that, the way that we diagnose changes, so our diagnostic criteria change, the tests that we can use change as well. So it could be just a correlate with enhanced technology and sensitivity to these disorders that, it makes the numbers go up. And then, when we look at the correlates between those things and dysbiosis, in some cases, it's difficult to determine what comes first. Now, in about, I believe I've seen the statistic is that in about 50% of individuals who have irritable bowel syndrome, they also have a diagnosed mood disorder. So it could be something like depression or anxiety. Dysbiosis is correlated with autism spectrum disorder. It is correlated with ADHD, anxiety, depression, anorexia. But the issue with some of those is that some of those mood disorders also come with eating habits. So individuals on the autism spectrum may have a less varied diet because they may have some sensitivity to the textures and the tastes. Or individuals with anorexia nervosa are extremely restricting their calories, and obviously food diversity So in some cases, it's hard to parse out, is it because of their dietary practices, or is it something that, the dysbiosis has a causal role in the development of this mood disorder. And then when it comes to autoimmune disorders, again, we see that there is dysbiosis. Part of where this gets really muddy is that we don't have a specific profile for dysbiosis, and that in some cases dysbiosis is a loss of beneficial microbes, but then in other cases it's just an abundance of pathogenic microbes. So we have a normal amount of healthy but too many pathogenic, or too many pathogenic, too few healthy. So dysbiosis is really just this umbrella amorphous term. But we know that, in general, when we look at people with a mood disorder an autoimmune disorder, that they have dysbiosis compared to our reference of what we consider to be healthy standards based on the Human Microbiome Project. But again, we don't really have a healthy profile of we don't have a healthy, we can't say like, oh, you should have this many bifidobacterium, this many lactobacillus, and only this many C. difficile. Like, we don't have those numbers. We don't really have a reference set. It's just that we compare the biomes of people who don't have a mood disorder to those who do have a mood disorder, so it's really hard to say, what are we referring to, because it's like we don't have a ruler. We have, one of those like flexi bendy tape measuring things, and it moves around really easily. So that's a challenge in really identifying the specific trends. What we can say with more certainty is that with an autoimmune disorder, we have an overactivation of the immune system, obviously. And there is crosstalk that occurs between the microbiota, those gut bacteria, and the immune system. So people think of the digestive tract as that's where my food is digested and absorbed. But really, like I mentioned at the beginning, those epithelial cells, those intestinal cells that are acting, to absorb our food, also play a huge role in our immune system. Just like our skin is a selectively permeable barrier that helps to keep pathogens out. And if you have a cut on your hand, now you have a site for infection because you've broken that barrier. It's the same thing with your intestinal cells. That's a barrier as well. So if we are doing things that increase our intestinal permeability and allow things to leak between the cells, that's like having a cut on your hand. It's just that it's happening in your intestines. Under those absorptive intestinal cells, we have something called a lamina propria, and it's connective tissue that supports those absorptive cells. Those epithelial cells are, because they're, and then we see this in mucous membranes, that epithelial cells need support of a vascularized connective tissue. That's one that has connection to our cardiovascular system, allows for the exchange of nutrients and wastes. That is abundant. The cells there are largely immune cells. So it's connective tissue. We have connection to the cardiovascular system, and then we have tons and tons of immune cells. And the primary immune cell there that is presenting antigens, that's like helping to grab things out of the gut, it's called a dendritic cell. So those cells are testing things that are going through our digestive systems. They're just grabbing things. Hey, okay, this is an antigen. I'm going to show that to another cell called a T cell, and that T cell is going to say, oh, this is a pathogen or not. And so in some cases, those dendritic cells may be just a little bit hypervigilant, and they're grabbing too many things and then showing them to the T cells, and the T cells are, there's some issue of mistaken identity, and then they say, oh, this is really a serious thing we have to have an immune response to, but it's actually, something that's labeled as your own cell. It's just that your immune system can't recognize it properly. And so that can then, lead to an immune response in the gut, or it could lead to more of a systemic immune response. And all of the inflammatory compounds that we're making, a large number of those can have an effect on the brain as well. So we could certainly have a link there between gut dysbiosis and mood disorders.
Yeah, it's such a big topic. There's so much there. Now, I guess the way that folks can think about an autoimmune condition in regards to sort of the foot soldiers, the army and stuff like that is friendly fire, right? So you're sort of killing your own team. And
Yes.
when there's an autoimmune condition, and what folks typically hear about is leaky gut associated with that, but more realistically, increased permeability, where things are getting in where they're not supposed to be, like you mentioned.
Yes.
How do you recommend folks go about sorting that out from, say, a nutrition and lifestyle standpoint, or just starting? Like, some people have had a lot of success with the autoimmune paleo approach, or like you mentioned before, the low FODMAP diet, maybe eliminating, dairy or something like that. Like, where do you recommend folks with an autoimmune condition that were interested in sorting this stuff out or experimenting a little bit start?
I mean, you're definitely right that the elimination diets can be helpful. And I've heard the same thing, that people have had, benefits from the anti-inflammatory diet, although I think that name is sort of silly, but, it's catchy. But or the low FODMAP. And I've seen some individuals who have, even non-gastrointestinal issues, but just other autoimmune disorders that, they do basically a food elimination and then tolerance test. So in some cases it's gluten, in some cases it's dairy, and it's not that gluten sensitivity could exist. Certainly an actual gluten allergy exists, celiac disease, but it may not actually be the gluten. It could be other enzymes in wheat that can cause an immune response. But if eliminating that improves symptoms, then it doesn't matter really whether it was gluten or not. It's just that you figured out, whatever correlates are there, you removed those, and that's beneficial. So I would say, start simple and just be consistent with whatever diet you choose. One of the biggest issues is that people start for a few days, and then, they have something that comes up, that they go out to eat or something like that, or they're not sure about what is in a food, but then they still eat it. And now they've added so many variables that they can't then determine what the actual cause was. So, just be consistent. There's not going to be like a one size fits all approach that, everyone will benefit from low FODMAP or everyone would benefit from the autoimmune. I use low FODMAP and see that it's successful, so I promote that. But, just whatever you're going to choose, make sure that you stick with that and give yourself 2 weeks of, being strict. Not that it's not going to be a lifestyle, but in order to really determine what's causing issues, that's what you have to do to the best of your ability. So, just prep your own food and, don't go out to eat during that period of time. And then, then you'll be ready to do the food introduction test again. Now, in some of the other issues, you can actually go in for to be tested for celiac. There are actual tests that people can have done. Biopsies are usually common when they're trying to determine the presence of ulcerative colitis or Crohn's. But your physician will usually need you to do something like manipulating like the gluten in your diet to make sure that those tests are still accurate. So that's the other thing, is that if you do want to, go in for testing for these things, just be aware that there may be a period of time where you have to modify your diet in order to ensure that you'll have the most accurate test possible, and that they can be very invasive when you're, testing for these possible autoimmune diseases. Just to be aware of that, certainly if you think, and the other thing also is that, if you have one of the autoimmune diseases, one of the inflammatory bowel diseases, your symptoms are probably going to be very, very severe. Or if you have an actual exocrine pancreatic inefficiency. So that's actually your pancreas isn't producing sufficient enzymes for digestion and absorption of your food. You'll have really, really severe symptoms. So if you do, then, certainly don't put off going to the doctor for something like that. If you're having like very oily stools and you're losing weight, or, passing things that are not stool then certainly go to the doctor. But if it's just that you're having gas and bloating and things like that, then it's, you probably would be okay doing just one of those elimination diets.
Yeah, and I think one of the biggest take-home points is giving it a solid go, right? Giving it 2 weeks, because 2 days isn't going to cut it. Like, give it a solid 2 weeks, really stick to it, see if you get the benefit, and then it's like 2 weeks for the rest of your life. So it's so worth it, right?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, the feedback that I get from the clients who use the low FODMAP, they're blown away at, the initial just improvement in bloating and like stool regularity and things like that. And then it's like the time is going to pass anyway. But now they feel so much more liberated because they're like, oh, I know that I can include this food, but like, I know I can just avoid this other food. It's not a guessing game, and it doesn't, run my life anymore. And they just feel physically and mentally so much better because you have now agency and you have control over those symptoms, rather than wondering like, oh, is today going to be a good day or a bad day? And then just having to live with it, I think that's one of the best things that I could wish for anyone is to have agency over their health.
Absolutely. Some of my clients that I've worked with that have had autoimmune conditions is, they avoid making plans in advance because they just don't know how they're going to feel. And so at that point, it just sort of takes over their life. And so if somebody with an autoimmune condition can experiment with something like this, or just digestive distress, because that can happen for folks too. It's like, how far am I going to be from a bathroom or whatever, that they can, like you said, have agency and then choose from a place of actually knowing what works and what doesn't, and then being educated from that place as opposed to just being almost feeling like you don't have your power or control in the situation. Yeah.
And that's why I get really frustrated about these tests that are not validated. They are literally preying on people's fears and anxieties, taking their money and then giving them information that isn't empowering them at all, because now they just feel at a complete loss because they've gotten this list of 20 foods that they can't eat that were part of their habitual diet. And it's just, it's not transparent, and it's just really the antithesis of evidence-based practice, and it's really frustrating. And I can't tell you how many people I've had say like, oh, I spent so much money on this, that, and the other thing, and now I know it was just, I can't eat apples.
Totally. Oh man, yeah. And something like an apple too, or maybe it's a banana or whatever it is. It's kind of confusing for folks because it's inherently a healthful food, so they feel like they should be able to eat it, or some green vegetables or cruciferous vegetables that cause them distress without, but then they're thinking to themselves, it's a healthful food, so how would this be causing me harm?
Exactly. Yeah. Like we vilify, the conventional junk foods and whatnot. And it may be that they tolerate those just fine. But yeah, apples and bananas might, really cause gastric upset. And it, like I said, it's so innocuous. You think that, surely these things aren't causing me problems. It's got to be, the bread because it's got gluten, and like maybe you're just fine with that. But, it's actually, it could be the apples or some of the vegetables. I mean, I know from my own elimination diets, I can't do spinach. And like, that's, such a big health food, and I love the taste of it, but I can't have it. And so, it's just one of those things like, oh, at least I know that. And I'm not trying to guess, is today going to be a good or a bad day because I've got that in my diet and I haven't been able to figure out that that's the issue.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so individual. I mean, for me, it's onions, garlic, and then bananas are fine. But if I eat a banana that's too green, I actually notice because of maybe the resistant starch or something, but it just doesn't agree with me. So some people will be able to tolerate, raw vegetables or cooked vegetables or vice versa. And so the cooking methods, it can get a little bit nuanced, but just very specific. So for the folks listening, just it's individual to you.
But what's funny is onions and garlic are two of the biggest FODMAP offenders.
Oh, totally.
Yeah. I mean, I've had, that's been usually my recommendation is to even watch out, in your spice mixes, if you're trying to do low FODMAP, that a lot of times they'll have dehydrated onion and garlic and whatnot. And it's such a bummer because it's like, oh man, that stuff is so good. Maybe in minute amounts like that, it's not a big deal, but I would just say, just for those couple weeks, just to say that you 100% eliminated those things. And that way, when you put them back in, then you can really tell. But yeah, you're right. It's just from person to person. It's very specific, and it's a time commitment, but I think it's really worth it.
Yeah, I think so too. Now, as far as what to do in order to have the most robust immune function possible, what sort of staples would you recommend that folks implement first and foremost as take-homes?
Well, I would say, we don't necessarily want always a robust immune response. I would say in terms of like regulating immune response, so making sure that we have the correct immune response at the correct time, because we want, ideally, after exercise, we want to have a transient immune response. We want to have a slight inflammatory response. And then we want to have an anti-inflammatory response after that. So just like we do need pathogenic bacteria, we do need inflammation. So the idea of, because people are on always on a pendulum of like, oh, we don't want, too much is bad, so we want none of it. That's not necessarily the case. One of the things that it looks like is important for having a regulated immune response to something is having a diverse biome. In comparison to, in mice that have no biome, they actually, we call these germ-free mice, they actually will have an exacerbated immune response to something. It's almost like the microbiota play a role in modulating our immune response. Also, like I mentioned, if we're overtraining, that can have an immunosuppressive effect. And so we won't be able to mount an appropriate immune response. So in terms of making sure that we have the appropriate immune response to the extent that we can even control it, because there are some things that we can't control, ensuring kind of the basics that we have a diverse diet, that we're getting in sufficient nutrients. Because the other thing is, if we're chronically dieting and we're in chronic we're in chronic energy deficit, that's not going to be supportive of tissue repair and cell turnover and things like that. So that can be one thing, that we're periodizing our nutrition so that we have times when we're at maintenance, which would be a lot of the time. And perhaps we have some times where we're massing, and then we control and limit the times that we're in a caloric deficit. Ensuring that whatever foods we're choosing are nutrient dense, because there are vitamins and minerals that play a role in immune function. Zinc is a big one. So our, nutrient density, and then also periodizing our exercise plan so that we're not balls to the wall all the time, which is super popular right now. We want to have these workouts that are like making us throw up all the time and like,
just
how hard
hitting MRV like every day.
Yes, exactly. Don't max out every day. And if you are an endurance athlete and you are at a point in your training where you're training for hours a day, or you're training with a lot of heat stress, be cognizant of the fact that that is going to be immunosuppressive, and it's going to likely cause intestinal permeability. So during exercise, nutrition plays an important role too, because it's beneficial to have a carbohydrate-containing beverage that can reduce gastrointestinal permeability. Now, a couple things that are popular right now that I don't see evidence for. One would be collagen supplementation. Have not seen any evidence. I've seen very limited evidence in like weaning piglets, but none in humans, that collagen plays any role in intestinal permeability or integrity. Now, glutamine supplementation was popular. There were a few articles published on glutamine supplementation and heat stress in athletes. And I found it curious that those that replicate that, in which they replicated findings using different testing parameters, but it was actually out of the same lab. So I don't know if you would want to count that as like two pieces of evidence or not, because if it's from the same participants. But other papers haven't been able to replicate that finding. because glutamine is such a common amino acid. You can get it very easily from your diet. And even though it is used by can't talk today. Even though it's used by enterocytes, we don't need to, like, we can actually produce it through what we call transamination. It's not an essential amino acid. So the likelihood of depleting your glutamine stores is very low if you're eating, a diet that's sufficient in protein. Perhaps if your diet is not sufficient in protein, that could be warranted. But right now, there's really no evidence. And especially, outside of like the heat stress in athletes, I haven't seen anything else that indicates that glutamine supplementation would be beneficial. So yeah, glutamine and collagen, I would say, save your money on that, especially the collagen. Like, it's really popular right now, but collagen is poorly bioavailable. That means we don't digest it very well. It doesn't really give us any beneficial amino acids. Like, we can rate protein based on its amino acid content, digestibility and stuff. And something like whey protein, we get a score of like 1, which is the highest. And collagen probably gets like a 0. So yeah, so it's just not, it's really not beneficial. And, if you're going to spend time and money on something, spend that money instead on your diet so that you're having, a plentiful diet, a plant-centric diet. But aside from that, certainly periodizing your training, like I said, making sure that you are, giving yourself periods of time to rest and recover, and not training MRV all the time. Like, you have to deload. People kind of they ignore that, but you'll reach a point of diminishing returns. Like, overtraining means that you are training beyond the adaptations that you can make. So doing more is not going to make you better.
Yeah, and for folks with like even the potentially the glutamine and stuff like that, like. Mm-hmm. Even if that stuff does have some benefit, it's totally just the icing on the cake. So if you're focusing on that stuff instead of like, nutrition, movement, sleep, stress management, light, dark cycles, stuff like that, totally missing the boat.
Yeah, exactly. I've said it's like putting like super fancy, low rim tires or whatever on like my old 97 Ford Escort. Like, the air conditioning was broken. It had over 200,000 miles. Adding some fancy tires was not going to make that a better car. But it was good, while it lasted. But yeah, at that point, it's like there are so many other things that need to be addressed. Like, are you, how is your diet? How is your water intake? How's your sleep? Because that's a huge one. Your stress. There's a link between the brain and the gut. The gut kind of has its own nervous system. It's got the enteric nervous system. But there's a bidirectional communication. So the brain can control the gut, and the gut can influence the brain. So if we have, a lot of stress going on and we have chronic cortisol release, that's going to influence the gut. It's going to influence our immune system as well. Not to say, because adrenal fatigue, there's really no evidence to support that actually exists, but certainly we can say that there is an immunosuppressive effect of chronic cortisol, and that's going to be released when we have a lot of really high intensity exercise going on. So, in order to cause adaptations to exercise, we really need to be within probably, 50 to 80% VO2 max. But if we're training always at 80% or pushing up to 85, and like that's what we're doing every day because we're killing it on the treadmill and we think we have to run an hour every day, that's where you're starting to bump up against that. Yeah, you're getting some adaptations, but you're also going to be increasing your risk of, overtraining, overreaching, and, GI distress and things like that.
Yeah, that whole adrenal fatigue stuff is a whole episode in itself, and I'd love to get somebody on as far as like the HPA axis dysregulation, but that buzz term adrenal fatigue has been thrown around. It just won't go away.
Yeah, I know. And it's like, it's the same thing where I don't know, I think it's just kind of a conflation of what, the actual physiological processes that occur versus how we interpret those and kind of spin them in the media. Like, yeah, you'll have adrenal activation. Yeah, you have increased sympathetic nervous system tone while you're exercising, but like you don't tire them out, like your organs all respond to stimuli. Like your lungs, you don't get lung fatigue because you breathe all day, like people don't talk about that. I kind of made a joke about that. Like, people talk about fasting to like rest their digestive systems. And I'm like, well, but you don't rest other things like that you're using all the time, like, well, you rest your brain kind of while you're sleeping, you're moving toxins from your spinal fluid and whatnot, but like you're using a lot of your organs all the time. And that's what they're there for. Eventually they do wear out, but like that's hopefully way down the line. And it's just a normal part of our human biology, like things wear out over time. So like adrenal fatigue, we're not going to like fatigue your adrenals. I think what people find is that, they're tired and perhaps weight loss has stalled because they were overtraining and, outside their hour in the gym, they go home, they're tired, they sit around and do nothing. Their appetite has increased. So they eat a little bit more. Then their energy deficit is gone. Adrenal fatigue.
Well, that's an interesting one, actually, as far as fasting or just not eating for a period of time and giving your digestive system a break. So do you think that sort of just constant feeding, and because meals take hours to digest, obviously, do you think that round the clock digestion is okay? Or what do you think's going on there?
Well, I mean, we do fast while we're sleeping. So we have different phases. We have our like a postprandial phase, like we've just eaten, and then post-absorptive. We've absorbed everything. Our digestive tract is empty. And then we get into like early and late fasting and starvation. So, there have been studies that have shown that fasting may increase lifespan. In rodent models and animal models, and that it does have, does perhaps play a role in just the way our cells are behaving because they have these periods of time where they're not receiving nutrients. And so it's sort of like things slow down because we don't have nutrient availability, and maybe with reduced cell turnover, because every time we have cell division, our telomeres shorten, and that's sort of what's been implicated in aging and dying. So that's where the idea kind of comes from in terms of like benefits of fasting and longevity and things like that. I think we still need more evidence, obviously, in humans, but it's really hard to do that because you have to like follow a person or a group of people for their whole lives and like see who dies sooner. And, those things just like, it's not a realistic research project. But actually the movement of food through the digestive tract is really important, solid food specifically. So if you have an individual who is receiving enteral nutrition or parenteral nutrition, so that's tube feeding, some of the things that you have to look out for is that this person may have no food moving into the, through the esophagus, through the stomach. Kind of depends on where you put the tube, or if you're feeding them intravenously and things like that. If you don't have food moving through the digestive tract, those muscles will atrophy. And even if you have a person who's just completely liquid food, that can still cause some atrophy as well. So when we put a solid food substance into our digestive tract, the muscles there, we have a couple different layers of muscles, will squeeze the food in these wave-like contractions called peristalsis. And that helps to churn the food, so mix it all around so that it comes into contact, like all surfaces of the food come into contact with the absorptive cells, and then moves it from one end to the other, hopefully in a smooth movement so that once it gets to the end, it's pretty much all waste products, and then you expel that. So that's one thing to think about, is that like we do actually want to, it's sort of like exercising our muscles. We need to put those smooth muscles to use. In terms of, what else is happening during digestion and absorption? Well, we have enzyme production, but we're producing enzymes all the time. I mean, we're producing thousands of proteins every minute, more than that. I mean, that's a vast underestimation, but every single one of our cells is constantly producing enzymes. enzymes are what catalyze all of our metabolic reactions. So like every single cell in your body is doing chemical reactions, is doing metabolism, and the enzymes are catalyzing that. So our digestive enzymes are doing exactly the same thing, and we just make them on demand as needed. When we have, and some of them are sort of like ready to go in the stomach, we have just forms of them that aren't activated yet, but then when we start producing a lot of stomach acid, it cleaves those, and then they become active, and then we start the process of chemically digesting our food. Then once it's ready for absorption in the small intestine, in some cases we do have to use ATP. We have to use energy to get those nutrients into the cells, but other things will actually just diffuse through. And so it doesn't actually, require any energy on the part of our cells. It just kind of happens naturally. And then we absorb our food, and then it's taken up into our cells. And then, anywhere from 1 to 4 hours after we've eaten a meal, it's out of the stomach, and it's probably been absorbed and whatnot within like 6 to 10 hours. So usually by 12 hours, you're considered to be in a fasting state. So most people are usually going to be close to that between, dinner and then waking up the next morning. So in a way, we do fast daily. It's just the length of our fasting time. That's not to say that we know that you don't have to wake up first thing in the morning and eat breakfast. Like that's a myth, but not that, fasting is going to help rest our digestive systems. It's not necessarily something that really needs rest. It's just something that we use on demand. And it arguably gets, more rest than other enzymes in the body and other systems in the body that are going all the time, like our cardiovascular system. Never rests, always exchanging nutrients and wastes, always exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide forever and ever and ever until it stops, and then we stop. So that's my opinion on it. Now, if I saw that there was a lot of a large body of evidence that said that long-term fasting was beneficial for gut health, sure, I would absolutely change my mind. But right now, I just don't see anything that supports the idea that fasting gives our digestive tracts a rest, or that they need to rest beyond, our normal 8 or so hours when we're asleep.
Interesting. Yeah, that's really cool. The way that I sort of think about this is that so many folks are either overeating or experiencing some sort of digestive distress because they're intaking so many foods that maybe they don't tolerate, maybe they don't know, whatever's going on. But I had a client over the weekend that had a really extreme response because she ate out an abnormal amount over the weekend. She had some friends in town. And so she said, "What foods do you recommend I eat?" And I said, "Well, I don't recommend that you eat anything. First of all, give it a minute, because you're super bloated. But then also, if you are going to eat, obviously if you're hungry, then stick to sort of single minimal ingredient foods. Keep things simple. Don't go crazy with spices, sauces, all that sort of stuff." So I think that it's tough because the average individual could probably benefit from, just taking a minute. But I don't know about most cases, but where you are going, 8 to 10, maybe 12 hours without feeding, you really don't even have to think about it.
Right, exactly. And you're totally right that if a person, they really went kind of off the rails, or they're having some nausea and stomach upset, usually it is recommended that they eat a bland diet. So things just like plain toast. We kind of mentioned, we knocked apples a little bit earlier, but if you know that you can tolerate applesauce or something like that. So soft foods that are easy to digest, limiting acidity, and even limiting fiber for a little bit can actually be helpful because, if you're having a lot of gas and bloating, fiber can actually, exacerbate that. But yeah, like you said, limiting the spices, certainly avoiding things like spicy foods and acidic foods and whatnot. And just, when you feel hungry, eating a small meal that's just kind of bland and basic and seeing how you feel, and then just waiting until you're hungry again. And I think, with intermittent fasting, really the way that it works when it does is that it creates an energy deficit. Because now instead of being able to eat, however many, 18 hours a day, if I limit myself to 6 hours a day, it's very unlikely that I'll be able to eat as much in that time period as I did in 18 hours. Not impossible, because it depends on what you put in there. But so I don't think that there's, anything wrong if that approach works for a person, or if it helps them become more in tune with their satiety signals, so with their fullness signals, and their hunger signals. Intuitive eating is really popular right now, and I think that could be a good tool for weight maintenance, given you are sensitive to your hunger signals and your fullness signals, and that you have had some practice looking at serving sizes. Because sometimes, I have clients who say, like, I don't eat that much, I just can't lose weight. But then when I give them the recommendations for serving sizes, they're like, oh, this is way less than I was eating before. Or sometimes people say it's way more, but it's not necessarily more in calories. It's just more in volume, because before they were eating a low volume of food, but it was very calorically dense, versus now they're eating vegetables and, whole grains and lean protein. So the volume of food is larger. That was sort of a roundabout way of saying, you can, there's probably nothing wrong with fasting, but there's also nothing wrong with, spacing your meals out. It really is just whatever is most sustainable for you, and, what feels comfortable. Like if someone has to eat because they're super active and they're trying to eat 4,000 calories a day, it's going to be maybe really hard for them to comfortably fit that in within a fasting, period or within a feeding window of 6 hours.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. It's going to depend on the person. Yeah. 4,000 calories and 2 meals is going to be,
exactly.
Yeah. That whole intuitive eating thing is really interesting, because the term itself, because we evolved in a food scarce environment, intuitively eating would essentially, by definition, require eating everything in sight all the time. Right.
Yeah. It's so funny, because I'm watching this pendulum of tomorrow's Thanksgiving. So we've got a bunch of people saying, hey, gyms, stop saying that we have to earn our food, and stop saying that we need to feel guilty and we don't need to restrict, and honor your cravings and eat what you want. And that's intuitive eating. And then you've got other people that are no, just have energy balance and, or work it off or whatever. And I'm kind of looking at these two camps hey, neither one of these extremes is really necessary. There's nothing wrong with, I ate more than usual today, so I'm going to be more active today. That's how we maintain energy balance. That's fine. And intuitive eating is great, but intuitive eating does not mean eat as much of whatever you want whenever you want. Because we have this little kid that lives in our brain that's oh, I want to eat ice cream for breakfast and, whatever, and then go to McDonald's and eat chicken nuggets. And it's that is, if you actually had that child in front of you, you would, out of love for that child and care, say, oh, well, let's pick one of those treats today. But otherwise, we really want to make sure that we're making nutritious choices, because cravings aren't necessarily a thing that we need to give into all the time, in my opinion. Intuitive eating is I think it's just kind of been taken and people are running with it to mean, doing whatever I want, whenever I want. And that's self-care. No, I think self-care is, how hungry am I right now? Okay, I'm going to eat enough until I'm not hungry anymore, but not until I'm full. And I'm going to make sure that what I'm eating is of an appropriate portion size, and I'm putting in nutrient-dense foods. Doesn't mean that you have to weigh everything. I mean, I've definitely gone through periods of time where I'm not weighing things. I'm just half my plate's vegetables, and I got some whole grains in there and lean protein, and I'm good. And then I just monitor, how my clothes are fitting, or scale weight, or something else, to make sure that I'm in energy balance, because that's another part of self-care, is that, making sure that you're in energy balance, because a normal body weight, is one of the best ways that you can prevent some of these chronic diseases later in life. So yeah, I just think it's funny that like, people kind of, I think, get the wrong idea about intuitive eating. And like, I do want to use that term and I want to encourage people to do that at times during maintenance, but I don't want them to think that I mean, you really can eat whatever you want. But I mean, if it's one day out of the year, okay, sure, it's one day out of the year, approach that however you want, but like, I just think it's silly that people are like, oh, now you have to go to the gym and work it off. No, you don't. It's one day out of the year, but then don't guilt the people who are like, oh, I ate a lot, I'm going to exercise extra today, and be like, oh, you have an eating disorder. No, that's not necessarily the case either. Oh, man.
Yeah. And talking about, eating a little bit more and then compensating with more exercise, we would most folks would inherently do that via non-exercise activity thermogenesis anyway, without even being aware of it. So, either way, it might happen, right?
Yeah, exactly. I think the key is just, don't do it out of guilt as a compensatory mechanism. I mean, that's the only thing. That's when I say I have like rules with my clients, that's really one of my biggest things is that I don't want them to experience guilt or anxiety after whatever decision they have, like, okay, you overate at this meal. Now we don't say like, oh, you undid all your progress. That was really bad. Like you didn't stick to it. You're better than this. No, that's awful, because that's actually going to reduce their self-efficacy and then reduce their chances of success. It's just, oh, okay, well, examine why you might feel guilt or anxiety about that, unpack it, try to, come up with a potential different approach next time, and then move on and like go on with your life. I think that, making it a thing then makes it a thing. And now we're having like Thanksgiving Day wars between like the intuitive eating, self-acceptance people and the gyms. And it's like, I bet that, I know they're both coming from a good place. The gyms want people to exercise, because during the holidays, people do gain weight. Like that has been something that's been shown in the literature, that people gain several pounds and then have a hard time losing it over the next course of the year. And then they just accumulate over time. But taking it to extremes of like, you have to work this off, or like, oh, you have to run on the treadmill for an hour if you eat a piece of pie. No, that's kind of silly. I think it's just a misinterpretation of like how we could perhaps say things in a more tactical and effective way, like, oh, hey, you got all this energy now. Like now is a really good time to like go for a PR in the gym and like, make it a positive thing if that's what you want to do, but not guilting people either way.
Absolutely. Okay, so can you remind folks where they can find more of your work, your social handles? I know you're in the process of writing a book now, so where can folks find out more about you, Gabrielle?
Yeah, so they can find me on Facebook and Instagram as Vitamin PhD. If they message me there on Instagram, I always write back. Sometimes Facebook sends my messages like to the requested folder and I don't see them. So if I don't answer, it's not that I don't want to, I just haven't seen it yet. I also have my blog, vitaminphdnutrition.com. I post all of my podcasts up there, articles. I have a website linked there to the JPS website, because I'll be in Australia in June. So if they want to buy tickets to that and come see me in Australia, that would be super cool. And then, of course, they can find me on renaissanceperiodization.com. That's where my bio is, and that's, I do coaching there as well. So then our next RP Diet Book 2.0 is coming out sometime in the next few months. And then I am now in the process of literature searching and collection to add to all the notes that I already have for my upcoming book, which I'm hoping will be out at the end of 2019 or beginning of 2020.
Amazing. I'll link to all that stuff in the show notes. And just for folks, Gabrielle has been on an absolute podcast spree. So if you search her name in like iTunes podcast, Google Play, Stitcher, whatever, you're going to find a whole bunch of podcasts that she's been on if you wanted to listen to more of the information that she's putting out, which is awesome. So thanks so much for taking the time to educate us on the immune system today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right, guys, I'll catch you on the next episode.